Welcome back to another devlog. Last time I set up the foundations of my platformer and added all of the level elements. This time I planned to finally start working on those levels. Because of certain features I want to include, designing them is actually going to be slightly more complicated, but hopefully they'll still turn out great. In the end, you can decide how much I succeeded in that. Naturally, I first worked on the first level. I know sometimes people choose to make it later, but I don't think that's very beneficial here because I already have a good idea of what I want to include. The first level is obviously very important, since it's where the player learns how to interact with the world and what to expect of their upcoming journey. In my case, I wanted the level to be very simple, but I made sure that the layout would teach the player about every ability and basic methods of traversing obstacles. Starting from the beginning, you appear on a small ledge. You can only go to the right, where you'll fall to the ground and can practice moving around. You then have to jump over various steps and deadly spikes, before approaching an unreachable ledge. Nothing in the game tells you to do this, but I'm assuming most people could figure out relatively quickly that you can reach it by double jumping. The next room is a step up in difficulty, and requires you to avoid jumping into a spike. Importantly, you can use the double jump to skip the lower portion and reach the next room faster. The point of that is to show you that even though the levels are linear, there are usually different approaches you can take to beat a section easier or faster. You're then introduced to turrets, which are quite simple to understand. You have to time when you run under them, but you'll soon have to do that in a long sequence and when there are other obstacles like ledges and spikes. You then reach the exit and have completed the level. Overall, I think it's a pretty good introduction because it teaches everything it needs to, but it still has some engaging challenges. Notably, it doesn't have any intrusive tutorial, and although that required more effort, I think it does a good job of teaching everything through gameplay alone. Moving on to the second level, even though it's no longer the introduction, I still wanted to gradually increase the level of difficulty. I think it's important to consider what the player's skill level is at any point, but to do that, you have to consider how the level is placed in the context of the game as a whole. The layout is slightly more complex than the first, and you're introduced to turrets that shoot directly at the player. In general, I'll try to make every following level introduce something new, so there's always something to look forward to. At the start, you have to dodge horizontal projectiles, and then avoid some homing turrets. You then avoid multiple turrets at the same time, followed by a brief spike section. And finally, this. My hope is that this is the first section where the player looks at it and is stunned for a moment by how difficult it looks. Ultimately, the strategy is quite simple, but I think this would be a very memorable moment. I think it's good to sometimes make the player stop and think about the upcoming challenge. It adds some more complexity to the gameplay and prevents you from just shutting off your brain and breezing through every level. Oh, also, at the end there's one more interesting jump and a button that opens the door to the exit. At this point, I had 2 fine levels done, so I took a break from that to put some more effort into the menus, like finishing the settings menu and adding progression to the level select. There's something enjoyable about finishing things like these, because then I don't have to worry as much about how the gameplay segments interface with the overall setup. One risk with this is that if you make a major change while working on the game, you might have to go back and modify the menus, but I suppose if they're built in a way that's versatile enough, that wouldn't be something worth worrying about. In the menu, I also made the game show the best times you get for every level. I imagine that with levels so short, it would be a fun challenge to try and lower your time as much as possible. I also added a sum of best times, which combines all of the best times, so whenever you get a good time in one level, it contributes to this greater achievement. It's like the smaller you can make the sum of best times, the better you are. For the next few days, I basically worked exclusively on new levels. I was still really adamant that this game should have a short development time, and considering how the levels themselves represent a majority of the work, I wanted to make sure that I could make levels that are good, but don't take too long to work on. With this in mind, I was able to complete the first 6 levels in only a few days, which to be fair is an incredibly good pace, but for some reason I thought I could complete them much quicker. As I was working on these levels, I found that of all the aspects of making this game, the level design was easily the most mentally exhausting, which was surprising because I usually think of programming as being the most exhausting. I suppose it makes sense though, since designing a level seems to require more sustained active thinking at any given moment. This could be very bad for my schedule, since I might burn out much sooner than I'd expect, but that's something we'll just have to wait and see. For now, I'd like to take a look at a few interesting things in each of these new levels. Level 3 focuses on buttons, so you're initially shown how they work, and then you have to time when you use them to open doors. There's also a button with a delay that makes you dodge projectiles until the path opens. Next, you have to go out of your way to press a button, concluding with a crowded turret section. Admittedly, this level is one of the weaker ones, because buttons aren't particularly interesting on their own, but I wanted to introduce them early on so that I could use them more throughout the game. Level 4, on the other hand, is definitely one of my favorites. It starts by introducing the bar, which it uses alongside an interesting layout of spikes. You're then introduced to another level element, the laser, which you have to avoid as you make your way through a corridor. The next section combines both of these elements, challenging you to jump across bars above spikes while lasers strike in between. I think this room is particularly engaging because you can't stand still for too long, but you also can't rush through, so you need to make good use of double jumps and positioning to avoid all of the obstacles. You then have to dissolve all of these bars in a very interesting set piece and fall into a hole. This is also the first point in the game where you move vertically between sections. Lastly, there's a final gauntlet with bars and lasers before you finally reach the end. This level is clearly a step up in complexity compared to the previous, and I think it makes use of its elements well. Level 5 is very similar to Level 4 in terms of its complexity, though it also offers some unique challenges. It introduces the bubbler and uses a lot more verticality in its level design, as can be seen early in the level when you have to jump around this giant cross and when you have to reach the exit. The final hallway is definitely a highlight, where you have to jump underneath the bubbles and move quickly before you're killed by the next set. You also have to avoid some turrets at the end. This section was originally much more difficult, also including horizontal turrets, but I decided to remove them because I found the segment was too difficult to clear. Level 6 is where the game truly starts to get more difficult, partly because of the very first room. You have to fall into and then double jump over a bed of spikes, before timing a jump in between a laser and turret, jumping over some spikes under a turret, and then climbing up some bars. This level is meant to put to the test a lot of what you've learned so far. Next, you're introduced to the light bars, and have to dodge them as you attempt to reach a button. There's a section with turrets and bars, leading into an interesting area, followed by a final hallway full of light bars and tight gaps. Level 6 is another one of my favorites, and I think it's a good capstone to the first set of levels. While I was working on these levels, I became aware of a very strange bug that took me a while to solve. Basically, within certain coordinates, certain collisions were always offset by 1 pixel. Values being offset by 1 isn't a particularly unusual problem, but what was unusual here was that it only occurred within a certain range, close to the edges of the level boundaries. I spent a long time debugging this, and I never became fully aware of what the problem was. I was very frustrated until I settled with quite a simple solution. I designed levels to take place entirely outside of the problem region. Of course, this meant that I would have to adjust all of the previous levels and to leave a good amount of wasted space, but I was determined to not waste more time than necessary, and ultimately this approach did solve the problem. That leaves me at the start of day 12, and 19 more levels to go. Honestly, I've gained some newfound confidence, as development has continued to go mostly smoothly, and actually a large portion of the game is already finished at this point. Of course, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot more work to do, but I'll continue to go into more detail next time. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye.